Welcome to Spiritual Psychology. My name's Renee McKenna. I'm a therapist and shamanic healer. And today I want to talk about becoming an emotional grown-up. I know a lot of adults. I don't know very many emotional grown-ups. A lot of people develop their social emotional skills in middle school and high school and pretty much stop then. I know for myself, until I started to do really serious personal growth work, I stopped developing around the age of 15. And a lot of my emotional social skills were probably much younger than that, maybe around the age of 4 or 5. Our emotional underdevelopment generally shows up with the people that are closest to us. It also shows up in our parenting with our own children and with our relationship with our parents and immediate family. And I see that with a lot of my clients, and particularly in coupleship, where those deeper issues will come up and the lack of skill set and tools that we have to be able to manage difficulty with another person really come up. It's actually one of the greatest gifts of being in partnership or intimate relationship is that it calls us to grow on the deepest levels. It can also send us running screaming out the door because we can get faced in living color with our own deficits and immaturity, with our unresolved emotional issues, and certainly with those of our partner as well. Our emotional challenges can also show up in work environments with people in authority and with subordinates, and how we might use or abuse or fear or reject power. For me, the natural developmental progression of becoming a full grown-up, we start in childhood as dependent upon our caregivers and upon our teachers and our culture in general. We don't have much power. And then we move into adolescence where we become independent. And again, this is where a lot of people stop. And particularly if there's a lot of dysfunction or wounding in childhood, becoming independent feels a lot better than moving into the next stage, which is interdependence. Now, we have an independence-obsessed culture. We also have a youth-obsessed culture, and there's a lot of reasons for that, including the fact that people under 30 have more disposable income, and so there's a lot more marketing directed at them, which then infiltrates into our larger cultural experience of pandering to youth. And I have kids, and I pander to them, but that's not necessarily the wisest way to be throughout our whole life. We get a long time to be here, and every age and stage has something valuable and rich to offer us. And I know for myself, I expect to hit my prime between 65 and 75. You couldn't pay me, you couldn't force me to be under 35 again. Yikes. Middle adulthood is by far, so far, my favorite stage. And I actually look forward to aging as even being better. So being obsessed with independence really keeps us very self-centered and focused on ourselves. And simply living in American culture these days, we're all infused with a certain amount of narcissism or self-obsession. The idea of fierce independence is infused in our cultural mythology, starting with the Pilgrims coming over, fuck the English, we're out of here, we're going to go to a new country. And most of us will die the first winter because we are unprepared. I grew up near Plymouth, Mass, and it's very interesting to actually learn what happened with the Pilgrims. 45 of the first 102 people that came over on the Mayflower died in the winter of 1620 from lack of shelter, scurvy, and the general conditions aboard the ship. So much for fierce independence. And I know for myself, my own fierce independence was nearly fatal in my own life because I didn't want to need anyone. And that was rooted certainly in a lot of fear. It was rooted in resentment at the neglect and lack of love I felt in my immediate family. And so if you weren't going to love me, I wasn't going to need anybody. That can carry us through to a certain extent. Some people take that fierce independence and are quite successful in the material world with it. But emotionally, spiritually, energetically, relationally, fierce independence, it's an incredibly limited worldview. And we remain woefully underdeveloped and immature. Because the reality is, we're all interconnected. Now, again, this fierce independence that a lot of us feel is completely supported by Amazon. I don't even need to go to the store anymore. I can just press my phone and have everything delivered, from my Tide Pods to my eyebrow pencil, even to my food. And there's some idea that I'm independent, completely unaware of all of the people who grew the food, made the products, packaged the things, drove them here. I might never see the delivery man or all of the hard work and effort and people that went into creating the things that I consume, but they're there. And so it's an illusion of independence. My teenage son's kind of screen obsessed. He's also a minimalist, and he likes the idea that all I need, Mom, is the internet and a dog and some food, and I'm good. Well, we'll see how that goes. Maybe if I stop bringing him food into his room, that'll change. Not quite ready to do that yet, but because he gets grumpy if he doesn't eat. But anyway, that's my own dysfunction. We're working on it. But the true nature of reality is interdependence. Thich Nhat Hanh calls it interbeing, that we inter-are. That even if my son does get to be in his room on the computer talking to his friends on Discord, all the components of the computer were constructed by someone. The raw materials were mined, hopefully in a not terribly abusive way. That the house we live in was constructed and built. It happened to be by a friend of mine, so I feel more connected to that than I might. The chair I'm sitting on, the microphone I speak into, the water that came out of the faucet this morning when I washed my face. All of these things are dependent on the natural world and many people with much hard work. Independence is an illusion. In fact, my daughter's at the age now where she goes out to be with her friends, and she's only able to be independent because I give her money. And that money comes from my clients who pay me to do spiritual psychology work with them. And so my daughter is connected with those people, and they get their money doing their own work. So in reality, we live in this really deeply interconnected web. And being an emotional grown-up means understanding and respecting that process and everything and everybody that participates in it. Emotional maturity is a balance of humility and responsibility. I love breaking up words, and responsibility is the ability to respond. And that's really the essence of emotional maturity. Is humility and the ability to respond from that place of humility. Humility is not a word that's very popular in our culture because it's misunderstood. And for me, humility is not about being small or meek. The concept of humility has been sorely misguided by the church to mean playing small, hiding our light. To be humble is to not own our gifts, and that's wrong. True humility is to really own all of who I am, to be right-sized. Most of us tend to either be too big or too small. We take up too much room or we don't take up enough. And true humility is to take up the appropriate amount of size, to know what my deficits and challenges are, and to know what my gifts and skills are, to know where I'm broken and to know where I'm brilliant, and to hold all of it in the unique configuration that each of us is. To be working to develop where we're underdeveloped, and to be polishing and strengthening the unique gifts and talents that each of us has. Not for my own ego gratification, although certainly if I'm participating well in the larger system, my ego feels good, and it should. But we bring ourselves into the world in service of this interconnected web of which we're all a part. Because when we serve the web, it serves us as well. Because we inter-are. Independence is a fallacy. Coming back again to this idea of humility and the ability to respond, or responsibility, within this larger system. One of the first real prayers I ever learned in my 20s is called the Serenity Prayer. It's very popular in 12-step circles. It was originally written by Reinhold Niebuhr, who was a theologian in the 30s. And the Serenity Prayer says, God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. And so this idea of humility as an acknowledgement of who and what I really am, all of me, also includes the idea of what I have power over and what I don't, where I stop and where you begin, what's my business and what's not my business. For much of my life, I tended to take responsibility for things that actually weren't my business, and I did not take enough responsibility for the things that were. And this is kind of the essence of what's often called codependence, which is when people get together and try to compensate for each other's deficits or underdevelopment by overcompensating for the other person. I was actually raised with codependency as a model for relationship. And a lot of the essence of codependence is substituting neediness or dependence for actual love. And although it can create a sense of safety because each person needs the other to survive to some extent, genuine love, from my perspective, is actually about calling people to grow to the fullest expression of themselves rather than trying to keep them comfortable and safe. Because life is a verb, and we're either evolving or devolving. There really isn't a neutral setting, at least not for very long. So for me, becoming an emotional grown-up is about transcending fierce independence. I need to include that. I don't throw it out because I need to take full responsibility for myself. But I take full responsibility for myself in the context and in interaction, in an interface with others. To understand and accept, as the Serenity Prayer instructs, what I can change and what I can't change. Generally, what I can change is me. Generally, what I can't change is you and everything outside of me. We certainly have influence, but true emotional maturity is not needing to be in control. It's trusting the larger system, knowing we're a part of it, but we don't control it. And emotional maturity is when we don't feel like we need to control it. I love the quote from the great Sufi poet Rumi. Your task is not to seek for love, but merely to seek and find all the barriers within yourself that you have built against it. That's emotional maturity. I was working with a client last week who's in a new relationship. Very interesting person. He spent much of his life in prison. He actually got clean in prison and did a lot of personal growth work. He's a very humble guy, and he really wants to grow in his ability to be intimate. He was raised by a very abusive father. He's a big guy, and early in his life he was very violent and grew up in a culture that's very defended, certainly before prison, and then prison's not a super open place. Not a lot of emotional vulnerability in prison. And I told him the definition of intimacy, again, wordplay, into me you see. And his partner was having some emotional needs that she brought to him, and he felt his own judgment come up around what he was perceiving as her neediness. Really introspective, grounded guy. And we did some work around dissolving the judgment, but we talked about the idea of being a full grown-up, of interdependence, of just showing up and self-revealing. Isn't it interesting that when you have an emotional need, I have this judgment come up? I'm going to share that with you so you can see into me. We'll be curious about it. I'm going to reveal my deficits to you while taking responsibility for them at the same time. And that is an incredibly powerful place of humility and responsibility. We can just react out of our old patterned responses. If we do what we did, we'll get what we always got. And most of us are attached to this fierce independence. But becoming an emotional grown-up is to submit ourselves to the process of growing in interdependence, of bringing all of who we are into a situation openly, honestly, and without attachment to the results. I've been kind of a serial monogamist in my life. I've had a lot of long-term relationships. And I'll admit that for the bulk of those, I really believed that the other person's behavior held the key to my happiness. That if you would only be different, I would be better. And that's a position of complete powerlessness. I am dependent upon you for my own happiness. And that's a fallacy. Now, I'm not going to say that other people's behavior doesn't give me feelings or affect my life. Absolutely it does, because we are interdependent. But what I do with that experience, that's my responsibility. And I love what Eckhart Tolle says. We have 3 choices in every situation in our life. We can accept it, we can ask for it to change, or we can remove ourselves from the situation. That's my choice. And although it's often much easier to look outward and wish other people would change, because that's a lot easier. I wish you would change. If you would just change, my life would be better, right? But Really, it's always me that needs to change. In any situation, I have a part. And taking responsibility for that and responding, getting the ability to respond to my own part, that's emotional maturity. We don't have to be perfect. In fact, there is no such thing. Perfection doesn't exist. Each of us is a unique configuration of consciousness. And when we can hold that with humility and responsibility, we can come to the fullest expression of who we are, the deepest interaction with those around us, and come to the deeply satisfying experience of being a full participant in our own life, which for me is what it means to be an emotional grown-up. So your homework is to think about where you need to grow up in your life. I'm planning to offer some free workshops coming up with a variety of different topics. If you're interested, you can get on my mailing list. Shoot me an email, info@reneemckenna.com, or you can connect on my Instagram page @opendoorgrowth. Blessings on your path until we meet again. This is Renee McKenna for Spiritual Psychology.